We'll start off our next presenter. Kenneth Tuffy Helgeson is a Nako language instructor at the Hayes Lodgepole Schools. He's been an instructor for the past 13 years. Born and raised in Lodgepole, Montana. Spent the majority of his young life with his grandmother, Dora First Chief Helgeson, and countless other Nakota speakers on the Fort Belknap and Fort Peck reservations. Also in Mosquito First Nation, Carry the Kettle First Nation in Saskatchewan, Canada. Tuffy is active in many aspects of the Indian way of life. He, along with his wife of 8 years and their 3-year-old son, are involved with community involvement type organizations in Lodgepole. His belief in language and culture are the driving force, and he truly enjoys his work. I'd like to just add a story of when I met Tuffy and Helena. Dustin Monroe invited me to speak on a bill Jonathan Windyboy was pushing through for language. And after I seen Tuffy present, I realized he was truly what would say Kipita Kipuka, is a grandparent's baby with all the knowledge, and we're really honored to have him speak here today. So I'd like to announce Tuffy Helgeson.
Hadagucha biniu hanadaya hibi abet ne wamne ono emangia chenwasewak pagichida. Ambane hanakoni abijecha wowakna gigte ne dagu echamu dagu uspe makia bichen mikushi ne chinjana hunga weashiji abich. You hana chande washdem news abichen you hana yongi pibine. Again, my relatives, I'm really happy to be here to share and learn along with all of you in this great endeavor that we've all taken up. I really don't claim to know anything. I just try my best with a little bit of information that was shared with me. And I want to thank Ophelia for the beautiful words that she said yesterday. I was sitting way in the back in the corner there by my Blackfeet relatives because they're all crazy. They always raise me. I have to sit back there and make sure they don't raise too much hell. But as I was listening to Ophelia talk, and she talked about the journey that she's been on through her lifetime, it really empowers me to, and I truly believe that we are in a time of a great change. And with all your endeavors and all the people that are working throughout Indian country, we're going to see this happen. Our languages are going to come back. Language is acquired. It's not something that you can learn over the course of 4 years or the course of 2 years in a college. This is something that is going to have to be a commitment of your lifetime. And I'm not a fluent speaker of our language by any means, but I know enough to get in trouble. That's the good thing. I wrote a few little notes out here. Like Jesse said, I've been teaching for 13 years, and when I graduated high school in 2002, my grandmother was 89 years old, and I was all set up to go to Northern. I was going to go to college, and that's a really a strange story in itself. My mother's a white lady, so I was born half-breed. And about the first 8 years, 10 years of my life, my grandmother really didn't have anything to do with me. She kind of kept me at arm's length away because I was a breed. As she got older, and the bilingual program that Ophelia talked about, that was something that really impacted my life. By the time I was in 5th grade, I probably could tell you any noun imaginable. I just, whatever it was, I could label it. I didn't know how to put things together to make sentences, but I could label all of these nouns. And but as my grandmother got older, I remember one summer we were cutting hay. My grandma went to bed at 7 o'clock every night. No matter what was going on, she went to bed at 7. And I was moving a swather from one field to the next, and I was driving. Must have been 6th grade or so. And I looked up and I see her door was open. And it was late in the evening, so I pulled in there and with this big swather, and I go to the door and I open the door, and she's laying there right in the doorway. She wasn't moving, and I touched her. I figured she was dead, so I started squealing, and I was like, "Coochie, coochie," and I was, all of a sudden, her head rolled over, and she said, "Give me a cigarette." She'd broke her pelvis, and she fell and broke her pelvis, and she laid there for 3 hours by the time I got there. And the only thing she was worried about was the cigarette. I thought that was the craziest thing. So I get her cigarette, and from that time, because she was so crabby, I guess, I just pushed myself on her and pushed myself on her and pushed myself on her, and then through the course of my lifetime, she became my very best friend, and we went everywhere together. I really didn't do sports in high school. I didn't do too much because I was always with my grandma, and boy, she taught me a lot. So anyway, then in 2002, I graduated high school, and her health was really failing. She was 89 years old. So I decided that I would stay there and I would take care of her until, she went on the other side. And we were doing that. There were 3 of us, my aunt and uncle and myself. And then when people get older, they don't need to sleep. I don't know what that's about. She would sleep for 5 minutes and stay up for 4 days. And then she would wander around the house and she would fall over and hurt herself. So we have to do these, we just have to stay right up with her, and we had one of these hospital beds. I'd be laying there trying to sleep and the thing would start rattling. "Let me out of this, son of a bitch, I had a horse." So all of these things that my grandmother and I experienced. Well, anyway, the school year was coming up in Hayes Lodgepole there, and we had a superintendent. His name is Dr. Philip Shortman, and he was for us. He's one of the most highly educated people from Fort Belknap. He's also a Vietnam War hero. I mean, he's got the credentials. He's a really impressive man. He's also my uncle. So he phones just before school starts, and he said, "Nephew," and he's really a matter-of-fact kind of person. He don't monkey around. "I need you to be a teacher." And he hangs up. All right, I thought. So he calls the next week, and he said, "Well, you ready to teach?" I'm like, "Uncle, I can't teach. I don't know." So he comes over, and we're visiting, and he's telling me all these things. "You can file for this class 7, and you can do this, and you need to be a teacher," and on and on. So then he leaves, and I was visiting with my grandma, and she said, "No." She said, "You're half-breed." She said, "You don't know enough." She said, "That's important." She said, "It's important, and it's got to be done right." I was like, "Okay, fine with me. I don't really necessarily want to be a teacher anyway." We're getting closer to the school year, and he's calling and calling and calling. Finally, his mother, who's my grandmother's first cousin, she makes a special trip out. So we cook, and they're sitting there, and the conversation between these 2 ladies was really, it was an experience for me. She says, "Dora, if he don't do it, who's going to do it? There's nobody left." She said, "Even though he don't know a lot, he can try." She said, "This is where we're at." So this conversation was a long conversation, and finally at the end of that conversation, my grandma said, "Okay, do it." She said, "But you do it right." And those were some of the last conversations that I had with my grandma. So in my classroom, I have a picture of my grandma, and every time I'm up there talking, if I say it wrong or I do that, I'd look and I make sure, So anyway, yeah, give her a cigarette. So the things that I've experienced over the course of teaching and learning the language, I guess, is I was really fortunate just to have my grandma, because when I was a teenager, there were still a large amount of speakers on Fort Belknap. And I can remember taking her to the Senior Citizen Center in Lodgepole, and that was the dominant language. That's what we heard, was Nakota. You go there today, and maybe 2 people understand, but it's not spoken. But also through that, with the resurgency of our culture and our spiritual ways, I've met some great people. My relatives from the Blackfeet country. I've spent a lot of time in Canada, because the Nakota people in the United States, there are about 3 bands of us. Fort Belknap, 2 in Fort Belknap and 2 in Fort Peck. The rest of us are located in Carry the Kettle First Nation, Saskatchewan Mosquito, just different places up there, kind of around the White Bear area. But I've also been able to establish connections with those folks, our relatives there, and you know, their speakers are limited like our speakers are. So we've had this growing conversation over the course of my lifetime, I guess, to share with one another and learn from one another. So we still kind of have a base to go around and you know, ask for help when we get lost. And then the next one I have to tell you about is these people that are called Stonies. These Stony people are the furthest out of the Siouan language group. They're just above the Blackfeet up here. And I can't understand them. They're my relatives, but I can't understand them. And it's really bizarre, because when I get up and talk, they can translate verbatim what I'm saying. They're right with me all the way. And then when they talk, I have no idea what they're talking. It sounds like Russian or But that's evolution of language, because they have so many people, they never quit speaking their language, and their language grew. So I think a lot of times they take our base word and then maybe they cut it off, or they added something else onto it. So we're left to interpret what's the rest of the word. I don't know what they're talking about. But it's really cool just to hang around with them. Yes, every little while. So through the bilingual program, the things that I learned as a very young child in school. Oh, sorry. So I went back to be the teacher the next year, and it was really awkward because my students, I was sitting right next to them the past year, you know, in the English class. It was really strange, but the movement is there in our youth. They want it. They truly want it. They want to understand who they are. They want to understand their language. And it's up to us to do our best to facilitate that, to help them. Just like my grandmother said, we have to do it as good as we can. We have to do it as right as we can. Does that mean we're going to make mistakes? Yes, it does. So anyway, one of the first things that I learned as a teacher was you have to know what you're talking about. If you're going to be in a classroom for 50 minutes with kids, you have to know what you're talking about. It takes some thinking. I've worked at it. When I started, I was writing phonetic. And then my students were getting mad at me because every time I would write the word, I would write it different. And they're like, but last time you said it was this. And so we would spend more time arguing about how it was written than we were actually what was being said there. Yesterday, this was a question. I heard, I think it was my mother, Lenore, posed the question, you know, we're talking about phonetics, or we're talking about orthographies. I teach language classes in the community. I teach as far down as kindergarten, and then sometimes work for the college also. What I figured out is we don't need to spend time arguing over those things. When I teach adult ed, I teach phonetics. When I teach in the high school, I teach orthography. My students can pick up in the school, my students can pick up any number of documents and they can read it. They might not know exactly what they're saying, but they can read it, and it's pronounced as close to, or, you know, that's another thing my grandma used to tell me all the time. You said it right, but you sound like white man. And I used to think, how's that possible? But it is. It's very possible. So, for example, one of the things, this X represented the glottal noise. So they would say choda. Choda is the color gray. Well, then they'd also use this X and the same word. But this word is choba. So I guess to an untrained ear, it's the same noise. But actually, they're two different noises. The first one is more with an H, and the second one is more with a G. So those are things that you don't pick up on unless you're actually really, really listening. So I opted later on to try to read and write in the orthography because I forget who was saying, I think it was the lady sitting here, they match our noises in our languages. Ironically, in the 90s, I was in those senior citizen centers with all these old people, and they were talking about how are we going to write our language. And I got to hear all that conversation. Our language was never written. You're going to change it. It's not the same. You know, then others were saying, but if we don't write it, how are we going to teach it? So I got to hear all of those things. And then we'll go on to linguists and anthropologists. Oh my God, these are some of the goofiest people I've ever met in my life. So, through the course, and I was just telling Matt in the back there, I was just telling him, through the course of my work, as goofy as they are, they're very valuable people. They're very, very valuable people. If it weren't for the linguists in the 70s and 80s, if they didn't come and do the work that they did in our communities, there would be a big gap. There would be a big gap. And again, I was a little bitty boy sitting in my grandma's house. And I started smoking when I was 10 because my grandma didn't have friends. So I'd sit there But I remember these linguists come in and they would say, Dora, we're going to record you. And they would set up all their equipment and all these things and they would start. Then I remember my father, who was not a speaker of the language, came in at one point and they were doing their work and I was taking it all in and my dad blew up. And he said, what in the hell are you doing here? And why do you care? What are you giving my mother? You're going to take this and you're going to go make all kinds of money off what my mother's telling you and we're never going to see a dime. And I remember it was this big old fight and this anthropologist kind of started squealing and loaded up her stuff and she left. But I remember all of those conversations. As time went on, I actually had the opportunity to travel to the University of Indiana. I've been down there 2 times now, and I've actually been able to be a part of the process of translating from Nakota into English and reteaching these stories. I was also telling Matt that while we were down there, I got to travel with these old ladies. Oh, and they're so cute. But I like grandmas. Grandmas are cool. No matter what's going on, they're cool. We get there, and then in our custom, Nakota people, men kind of take the forefront. Well, my grandmas were 80 and 70, they were sitting there, and they should have been calling all the shots, but they'd sit there really quiet. So at the end of the first go-around there in Indiana, it was just killing me. I was like, why in the hell do you guys have all this stuff sitting on shelves down here? We need it in Fort Belknap. That's where it belongs. They won't join in and help me. They're just sitting there. So finally, at the end of that, we brought a lot of this information home. And I've gone back twice, and we've worked on a lot of things. And that's where watching the folks yesterday talking about the board games and, all of these things that are made, those are the next steps, and I'm really grateful to the people that are doing these things because today our children learn different. Even in this room, if you look around, people are still on their phones. Well, those are tools. That's not the answer. Those are tools. 13 years of working in this stuff, I've wasted so much time trying to program that phrasalator. Holy, you guys remember that thing? This is going to save us. And I'm sitting there typing all this stuff in. And I spent more time writing, than it actually was applicable to our kids. So they are tools. Now, the next thing that I wanted to talk a little bit about was the importance of reading and writing. Like I say, our children, we think different. And it has to be, for them, it has to be concrete. It has to look the same, it has to be the same, it has to be consistent. I don't know if I necessarily need that anymore. I just wanted to, here I am.
Push the down button.
Oh.
Do you need audio?
No. So I'm going to put Matt on the spot in the back there. This is my relative. He's also from Lodgepole. His grandfather, his name was Yamniaphe. 3 Strikes, George Shields. And I didn't know George. I saw him once at a New Year's dance in Lodgepole. When I was a little boy, I remember my grandma had me all fixed up and I was trying. And I remember George come dancing by and he had this big war bonnet on and his nice buckskin outfit and his big wing. And I remember I was looking, that must be Chief Joseph. But anyway, George passed away. And he was one of these people that were interviewed in the 80s. How come I'm not? What's going on?
Second screen. I forgot Max.
So anyway, George was one of these people that was recorded and documented by the University of Indiana. And thank you, Mom. His mind was so brilliant. Even at his age, he was in his late 80s. And his mind was so sharp. And the things that he was talking about meant so much to him in his life. It was just phenomenal to listen to him go through and tell these stories. This particular story is the story of his grandfather, Pronghorn. And it's a 64-page document. Halfway through the story, or not even halfway, probably a quarter of the way through the story, he said, Jenang. He said, that's enough. Maya Zigtachen. He said, I'm getting sick. So they stopped recording. And this was in the 70s. So what did they have in the 70s? Those tape recorders? Or, they couldn't just go back and see where they were. They had to rewind and all these things. He started to retell this story 2 weeks later, and he goes back 3 sentences verbatim. And he says the exact same thing 3 sentences before. And I was like, holy frights, I can't even remember that in English. But this meant so much to this man. The story was so much that... but kind of what I wanted to show, and where I'm having a hard time, is as we get these things out to our students, it has to be concrete. It has to look the same. It has to sound the same. All righty.
I know how to start your presentation.
Okay.
Get it full screen.
Full screen?
Yeah, do you know how to start your presentation?
Oh, it's just on a Word document.
Oh, I see. Let me zoom me out a little bit. Do you know where the zoom button is?
I'm about as good as you. I have
Yeah,
no
no.
idea.
Not really good on these guys. Nothing like that, right? No, of course not.
Let me just... Okay, so anyhow, we'll just go quarter at a
Apparently
time.
there's an arrow up in the upper left that you hit.
Oh, there we go.
Is this correct?
That's correct. You're awesome. All right. So again, and I was listening to the folks from the Salish community talk about, I didn't pay attention too much in English when I was in school. I kind of thought I knew how to write a sentence. And then when I started really trying to figure things out, I was like, hey, what the heck is this verb? And this is a noun, and this is an adjective. So I had to relearn all of this stuff and how it was put together. And again, these things about, you're not saying it right, that's not how my grandma said it right. I've never experienced that. In the 13 years that I've taught, I've not had one student come into my classroom and say, My grandma says it this way. My grandpa says it this way. That's scary to me because that means nobody's talking anywhere. I remember when I was in the bilingual, my grandma says it, that you're saying it wrong. So anyway, as we started working through these things, identifying words, you can't argue with George Shields. I don't give a shit who you are. You can't argue with him. He was 80-some years old in 1982 telling a story. This is as true a picture of language as there ever was going to be. So we started going through, and what I did for my students was I bolded the nouns, I italicized the verbs. And as we go through, now when they're reading it, they just take a little note, a piece of paper off on the side, they write down their verbs, or they write down their nouns. But it's within the verbs that we have to work. So this is, he says, on the spring day, I'm going to tell a story. So on the end here, that's my verb. And so then from there, we take this verb and we put it on a sheet, and they have to identify the root word. What is the root? And then they have to identify the person marker, the suffix marker. Is it in the present? Is it in the future? Is it in the past? How do we go? So they're able to go through and work with these things and play with these verbs. So anyway, at the end of this, 2 years ago, this 60-page document, it took us a whole semester to go through and actually get this story as good as we could get it. And then we had a play. The kids dressed up and they did the play, and of course there was narrators and all these things, and it was awesome. Quick and the long of this story was I never knew smallpox sometimes ended in death because they broke their backs, because they coughed so much. I never knew that. I knew they would get smallpox and the fever would kill them. So even from our standpoint, there's a lot to be learned. There's a lot of things that we don't know. We don't know about. I don't know. And I'm not going to go through and bore you to death with this story. This is a really good story. This is like a movie. Really, I really believe this story should be a movie. It starts out in the Sweetgrass Hills, ends up by Battle River. He ends up being an orphan, traveling down to Poplar with just a bunch of other little orphans and an old woman. He ends up going to fight the Blackfeet, and he stabs a Blackfoot man. He steals a top, and this Blackfoot man is on his knees in a fire, and this little boy stabs him. He's 12 years old. He becomes a war chief. I mean, this is an awesome story. And again, would have never been possible if those anthropologists didn't come at that time and record that information. So I think a lot of our problems are trying to figure out how to get to those people in the best way we can without intellectual property rights and all these other things going on. I don't give a shit who gets credit for what, as long as our kids are able to understand their language and it's acquired. So you can see from this, well, maybe, I mean, I can see from it in my own strange head, is when we get this in a 4th grade curriculum and the children are able to go through and read the story with the nice little pictures, with art, the artwork of our people or however we do it, you can see where that's really going to make a change. And I know the folks, the programming, the people, all of these people that are doing all of these important things, it's going to happen. We're going to see it happen. It's just going to take a little bit more time. My older brother, Terry Brocky, always says it took us 150 years to lose our language. It's probably going to take us 150 years to get it back. And we just got to keep working at it. My Blackfoot relatives, I love it. No matter where they go, there's always a contingency of elder people that lead the way. They're always there. And I remember that from being a small boy attending different conferences and seeing them. Today on Fort Belknap, I was just writing them out. 1, 2, 3, 4. We have like 5 fluent speakers of our language. And those 5 people I spend oodles amount of time with, and they probably just hate me because, how do you say that? What is this? But what I also found out was a first language speaker is very, very important, but that does not mean they can be a teacher. A first language speaker, it's natural to them. It just comes out. They can just say whatever it is they need to say. A second language learner has to understand exactly how these things are all put together. I think it's the combination of the two that would make a program. Because the first language speaker is going to be so valuable in training this younger person. And like Mr. Monroe was saying yesterday, I think he needs to start thinking about running for Jonathan's seat. Because these people, these people are pushing so hard for so many things that if we don't have Indians representing us on that level, we're going to slide backwards. So that's why it's important for our communities to vote. That's why it's important for people to get out there and run. The lady from Browning yesterday, the principal from Browning yesterday, her comments are so valid because we have this person that understands this particular part, but they can't apply it here because we're accreditation standards, all these different things. And I'm really curious. I want to make a trip to Browning to see how the kindergarten immersion program is going. Like the Salish, they just took off. Daryl Kipp, he just took off, and they're just doing it. I'm not that brave. But I want to see how it's turning out and what's happening, because everywhere we go, it's to make a speaker. Everybody's end result is to make a speaker. So does that mean if my student can pick this up and read it, pronounce correctly, is he a speaker? Well, we kind of ran that too. There was a man named Peter Bigstone, and he was from Ocean Man First Nation. He visited my classroom one day, and my kids just happened to be reading. He walks in the room, and they're all talking Indian, and he's like, what's going on? But they're able to enunciate correctly. Again, my grandmother said, that's right, but you sound like a white man. So we put stress marks. We make sure we identify where the noise is, how it's happening. And it's been for me, it's been so fulfilling just to see these things taken off, and it's going to take time. So I think a lot of times with our students, the Western thought process, for as much as we want to keep our identity, and it's just like my relative said, I opened a book, that's how I learned. I think that's where our students are now today too. We don't have that interaction with those grandmothers anymore. We don't have that interaction where you can just acquire language, you can just pick it up. Kind of, maybe not all the way. My adopted mother here, Lenore, her sons, Terry, John, there's 2 tribes on Fort Belknap, Gros Ventres and Assiniboines. And historically we were enemies. Kind of. Well, they always don't tell the history right? They just get everybody worked up and want everybody to scrap all the time. So anyway, through the course of growing, and again, the resurgency of our culture, growing within our culture and our ceremonies and different things and helping one another back and forth, I would say I could probably last in an Ani conversation for a fair amount of time because I've been around it so long, I've heard it so long, that when they're speaking Gros Ventres, I know what's going on, I know what's happening. And so I think it's just, again, it's time. We have to have that time to hear those things and how language is acquired, how we're acquiring it. So sometimes we end up with pidgin languages. We was even talking about that, John and Terry and I said, maybe we just need to combine Assiniboine and Gros Ventres together and just make our own language, and then we'd... But again, as we go through... Oh, we're fine.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
You're all done with it?
Yeah.
I'm still going to do this, though.
Okay. As we go through and we reevaluate where we're at and what's going on, we talk about the trauma. Everybody talks about the historical trauma, and that's really there, and that really is a part of our societies. And again, if the truth be known, on Fort Belknap, there are 3 groups. There are Nakota people, Ani people, and then there's Little Shell Chippewa people. Okay. Growing up in the community of Lodgepole, where I grew up, and my grandmother being crabby woman I said she was. And the racist, she was a racist woman. I was her own grandson, and I was half-breed, so that's kind of an indication of the kind of woman that she was, right? So it was, you stay away from those Grovants, and you especially stay away from those breeds. You have nothing to do with those people. Through this 150 years of Fort Belknap or whatever we had, it is so crazy. Just the dynamics of the communities are crazy. You have this group here, this group here, this group here, and they're all bickering among themselves. And we just got to get over it. I was checking out, Saskatchewan, what's the name of the university there?
University of Saskatchewan or
Regina?
First Nations University in Regina, and then there's University of Regina.
So they have a website, and I got on there and I was listening to the Little Shell Chippewa language. Man, that's awesome. It's a Cree verb or Cree noun and a French verb all the time, and it's pretty. We can teach that. Somebody can learn that. That can be offered in our schools. We need to find this sense of belonging. We need to find this sense of being together, helping each other, networking. I was sitting here thinking about how many of you have seen that 1930, is it 34, 32, Blackfoot, when they're all talking sign language, right? I'm glad this is being recorded because your great-grandchildren are going to look at this day the way we look at that day, right? So, and at that time we were speaking signs, so that also tells us that that's an important key in how we're learning. And it's something that we need to bring back. I just wrote, I'm not going to take an hour. I know I'm not going to take an hour. I was just writing down a bunch of thoughts. From one language to the other, we have these crazy stories, and I should have started with this story. I have a good friend, his name's Harris Rock, and he's in his 80s, so he's crazy. He's one of these people that as soon as he sees you, and I know a lot of you get this, you striving speakers, as soon as you run into these people that really speak, it's on, and as soon as they see, they're questioning you, asking you all, Harris tells a story, he said, and you're going to have to excuse me, but Harris tells a story. I just think it's neat to listen from one language to the other. He says when he went to school, he didn't have to go to boarding school. He got to go to school in Harlem, just across the river there. And he said there was about 5 of us Indian kids, and we were all sitting in the back. We didn't know what was going on. First day of school. And the teacher gets out these stick horses, and she's giving everybody stick horses, and she's got these little straw hats, she said. And that's the first thing all us Indian boys, we were bucking around and following around. No, we don't know what they're saying. So they teach us this song, My Home's in Montana, I wear a band. And we're all riding this horse around singing this song. And at the end of the song, he said, we take our hat off and throw it in the air and we all holler like cowboys, he said. That was my first experience in school. He said, so I get home, and he was one of these grandparent babies. So the whole house was full of people just waiting for him to come back, his aunts and uncles and grandmas, and they're all sitting there, and he comes walking in, and he's just happy. Somebody says, hey, hear me, Tagosh, I bet in the Dago spechujik the hair. He said, oh, he said, somebody says. He said, what did you learn, grandson? He said, I learned I'm a cowboy. Really? They said, he said, Daguyaka. He said, what do you mean? He said, Nagach awahim na je ono awaji uspema kiabich. Eh, they said. He said, they taught me how to sing like a cowboy. Go ahead, they said. So he's standing there. Ina, he said, Wagadodo nitaogi jim no dinkta. So she goes and gets her broom and takes it over. So Dad goes, gets his hat. He's singing his little song. They're all watching and sitting around. This is where it really gets berserk. At the end of the song, he takes his hat off and he throws it in the air and he says, Wahoo! He says, in my language, when you say hubin, that means to have intercourse. when you say why, you're saying I'm the one that's doing this. So he shows his hand there. Wow, who is So as you from one language to the next, you never know what you're saying until you're actually saying it. What are they teaching you? I think another thing that we need to do that is really, really important, and I see it in the high school kids at Hayes where I teach, if they have the opportunity to use it, they're going to use it. You don't go to the store and hear people speak your language anymore. Or we don't. I imagine they do in Crow. I imagine some Blackfeet people. You can still go and hear your language different places. You don't go to the restaurant. You don't hear it. We need to make places and reasons for our students to use their language. The governor came to our school last week. I don't know why. He was being nosy about something. He came, and our student delegates stood up. They introduced themselves in their language, their parents, where they live. They were happy the governor was there. These are non-traditional people, non-traditional students. But they know the importance of, like we're all saying, who we are. And I'm making that, identifying ourselves as who we are. So that's the other thing I think we're charged with is not everybody's going to go to the Sundance, not everybody's going to go to the Sweat, not everybody's going to go to the powwow. We're going to have to make reasons for our children to use our language. Maybe that means stick game tournaments. Maybe, I don't know. We have to be creative in how we make these places for our people to use their language. Our radio station on Fort Belknap, I always love it. I had a niece. She was about 10 years old. My older brother, his name's Buster Moore. He was on the radio, and every day you hear the same thing. He says, Nakonia Bishka. Try to talk Nakota. My 10-year-old niece was walking around, Nakonia Bishka. It's stuck in her mind. I don't know, but we got to build on that. We got to keep making those reasons for people to use their language. That's about all I got, guys. Any questions? Hopefully not.